the panel session. And I'd like to go straight actually first to Jess. Jess Truong. Jess, are you there? Oh, yes. Hello, Jess. Welcome.
Hi.
I thought I'd like to start off with you because your international experience is going to be pretty important to us. But given that experience, especially in terms of your experience in Australia, how integral would you say the safe system approach is in helping to achieve towards zero ambitions? And in doing that, perhaps you could give us a few little hints and clues about what lessons you've learned so that we could perhaps think about them here too in the UK.
Thanks, Tony. And I think it's a great question. I think that the safe system approach is not only helpful in achieving zero on our roads, it is the only feasible approach that would actually get us to zero. There's been some really good research that sort of has investigated which approaches would actually help us reach these road trauma reduction goals. And it's quite clear, a lot of jurisdictions continue to work in the continuous improvement space where they're making incremental changes to the system. But these incremental improvements will have a diminishing return over time, and it's unlikely to get us to zero. Similarly, if we use a cost benefit sort of approach, there will come a time as trauma reduces, it's going to be difficult to use those cost benefits to justify any further investments in trauma reduction. So really, if we're serious about getting to zero, safe system and the ethical approach is the only feasible option we have to continue to argue why we do want to continuously invest in road safety. So yeah, I do believe that the safe system approach is the only way that is going to get us to zero. So if jurisdictions are serious about committing to a zero trauma target, then safe system is the only way. But there are some things to keep in mind. It can't be an individual interpretation of what the safe system is. The safe system is very clear in what some of the underlying principles are in how we design that system. And one of the key ones, I believe, is around the human tolerance principle. We all have an inbuilt tolerance before we start to become injured and die. And that is just a universal principle. So designing that system is all about energy management. So if we want to get to zero, that must be the starting point of the design of that system. And it is a new way of thinking. So there are things that would require us to shift the way we have been thinking about road safety and our traditional approaches to road safety and move away from that to looking at how we can apply those safe system principles in a good way. And that's what we're seeing as being lacking at this point in time in jurisdictions around the world. A lot of people have committed to that zero target, but if you delve deeper into the supporting actions and strategies that go along with that ambition, they are very much still a traditional approach to road safety. And, drawing on my experience in Australia, where I worked in Victoria, when we try to sort of move away from the more traditional approach and sort of embrace that safe system approach, it does require a big change in thinking, not only just amongst the system designers. You have to get them away from the way we've always designed the system to this new way of thinking, but also the government, trying to convince them, okay, traditionally we have focused very much on road user behaviour, how to change people's behaviour, telling them not to drink drive, not to speed and all that, to actually moving into, okay, how can we build this system in a better way? So it does require a complete shift in thinking and the way we actually approach things. So I do think the safe system approach is the only way, but it does require a lot of work in shifting the way we think and also mass scale rollout of the countermeasures that would actually help us get there.
Yeah, but can I just come back on that then? If the safe system approach is, say, not universally adopted by all transport authorities, and there's a myriad of them in this country, is its effectiveness then significantly reduced or reduced to any extent? And I say that particularly because the UK is a small, compact country with myriads of, as I pointed out, highway transport authorities. Does it require them all to adopt it, or can we succeed with just some?
I think to get the best benefit, obviously, we would love for everyone to adopt it and actually roll it out. But once again, it has to be according to the principles. What we're seeing a lot is sometimes safe system is sort of explained as in terms of a pillars approach. It's all about safe people, safe vehicles, safe roads and safe speeds. And a lot of times jurisdictions may think, okay, so long as we're working in one of these 4 areas, we are applying the safe system approach without really taking into consideration the interactions between those different areas. So it really depends on how people interpret what the safe system is as well. Otherwise, it can just be business as usual with the safe system branding. And that's what we're seeing around the world a lot is you've got the towards zero branding, you've got the vision zero branding and saying that we've adopted the safe system approach. But if you delve deeper, it's still business as usual, the way we've done things, just with a safe system branding. So it does require that shift.
Yeah. I mean, with that in mind, Matt, I mean, is it fair to say that safety partnerships are at different levels as far as the adoption and implementation of the safe system approach is concerned? But given what Jess has just said, I mean, what measures do you think the safety partnerships need to take to ensure that they're all up to speed with safe systems and we can progress together? And importantly, I've got to ask this question, and who pays for it all?
Yeah, very good question, Tony. I think, obviously to pick up on what Jess has said, as well as what some of the presenters earlier this morning, such as Jeremy and Tanya particularly said, I think an understanding of the safe systems approach is probably the first element, and making sure that that's not just at one level in an organisation, but an understanding of what that means for the organisation across politically, officer level, and decision makers within that as well. And I think Jeremy highlighted from the National Highways perspective that there's a need to understand what you have high degrees of control over and what you have more of an influencing role in within that. And I think that's a really important first step. So then within that, actually reviewing what your current strategy is and current policies and reviewing that against the safe systems approach, as Jess has just mentioned, it's not about just in name only, but actually about how important it is that we consider road safety and safe mobility as a whole, not each element in isolation. And I think that's really important. I think the message I'd want to get across to people considering this is actually you don't have to do it all on your own. And we've heard how important it is that we don't end up with lots of different versions of the approach across the country. And there is support out there to help with that. Conferences such as this, PACTS, and the knowledge that's able to be shared there. Our authority in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, we work with Agilicis and Traject. I know Tanya mentioned working with a number of authorities across the country. Road Safety GB as a platform to share ideas and work with other local authorities that are either interested in doing this already somewhere along the journey, and sharing ideas and making sure that this is a collaborative approach across the industry. To come on to your last point there, and possibly the most important about funding, I think there is an element of misconception around the fact that shifting to a safe systems approach suddenly means you have to invest a whole lot of more money. I think the key thing for me is that if you're currently investing in road safety, you can change the way it's invested in line with the safe systems approach as a starting point. I think obviously in taking that approach, there's lots that will come out of that may require additional investment, but it's more about highlighting the value of that significant additional investment by taking the safe systems approach and giving the opportunities to secure that funding. And I think the message for me to people who hold those, from me to people who hold those funding pots, is actually using your influence as funders to be able to say, actually, to use our funding, you need to do it in this way. And we saw a great example of that with the Safer Roads Fund, in actually taking the IREP approach and investing in the kind of the proactive preventative approach, which has rightly been recognised and awarded. And I think that's the kind of mechanism for funding that we'd like to see going forward.
Yeah. But given that what you said about the collaborative approach there, do you think as they stand, the safety partnerships are, if you like, fit for purpose in terms of a new way of thinking that Jess highlighted? Do we have the right sort of constituent parts in the partnerships? Do we need to broaden the range of memberships to include health if they haven't got health members in there, or indeed others? In other words, a more holistic approach.
Yeah, I think it'd be doing a disservice to a lot of partnerships to say that they don't include some of those members already. But I think, as you mentioned right at the top, the picture across the country is so different, and I think that's part of that review process. Is what do we have control over? What elements of the system mean that we need different partners involved? And for some areas, that's going to differ because the local makeup is slightly different. We've got third sector organisations involved in ours locally because we've got victim support charities that operate locally. And that's been included into our partnership. So I think absolutely yes, taking a holistic approach and looking at the safe systems approach as a whole, who needs to be engaged and involved to actually achieve those outcomes. That's the starting point, and then moving forward from there is the next steps.
Yeah, fair points. Amy, obviously the TfL has already had a lot of experience, as I understand it, on safe system, especially from the perspective of tackling vehicle safety itself. I mean, perhaps you could share with us what key lessons you feel can be disseminated to other large conurbations and localities with elected mayors to help enable that more widespread and successful implementation of a safe system measure.
Fantastic, and I'll talk particularly about safer vehicles, if that's okay, Tony.
Absolutely.
So firstly, just to talk about how we kind of interpret the safe system with regards to safer vehicles in London. So we take from the safe system that mistakes are inevitable, but deaths and serious injuries aren't. So people will always cross away from formal crossings, or kind of there'll be moments where kind of vulnerable or upset people accidentally step into traffic. They don't need to do that. But the thing that we can change is whether or not that mistake becomes fatal. So the way that we do that is kind of focusing on the ability to cause harm. If you walk into someone, you're fine. If you're hit by an HGV, you're very much likely less likely to be okay. And I think if we're looking at kind of the trends in road safety over time, you can see that kind of cars and people inside cars, so people driving or other car occupants, have seen the greatest road safety gains in the last 20 years of any mode out on the roads. And they're also involved in 80% of collisions in London that injure vulnerable road users. So people walking, cycling or motorcycling who are coming off worse in those interactions with cars. So what we kind of work on is we're trying to look at how manufacturers can deliver the same level of improvement for, in safety for people outside the vehicle as they've delivered in the last 20 years for people inside the vehicle. So what we are doing is we've got the HGV direct vision standard, which has come in now, and so you need a permit to come into London, and that it means you have to install a safe system to be able to kind of come into London, and that's about literally visibility. So just being able to see from inside the cab if someone is standing directly in front of the vehicle. It's kind of so minimal. That's the kind of basic standard we're talking about moving to. We're also talking about the bus safety standard. So that's about kind of what can we do with our own fleet to make that as safe as possible for other people who are on the roads. We're retrofitting active ISA to our buses and to half of our vehicle fleet. So that's cars and vans that we've got. And that's been kind of really successful so far in terms of helping our drivers manage their speed. We work with kind of our Transport Innovation Directorate works with manufacturers who are developing new activity, so who are kind of looking at telematics or looking at kind of new innovations that they can make to vehicles, and we look at how we can do that. And we also have the Freight Operator Recognition Scheme and the Construction Logistics, I can't remember what the rest of it says, but it's clocks schemes, which are all about like promoting safe driving behaviour, good fleet management practice, and crucially safe vehicles. So I'd say the lessons that we've got that are kind of useful for other people is that the kind of ultimate aim is about what you can achieve at the regulatory level. Like if we really want change, what we need is that to kind of come in the kind of EU standards and the Great British Vehicle Standards. That's where you'll really get kind of the impact and the market penetration. But what we can do is kind of help to create the consumer demand and also help the manufacturers to innovate in order for that to kind of eventually trickle up to the regulatory level. And what we found is it's really about supply chains, not your own fleets. So for any authorities who are thinking, oh my God, the idea of having to implement potentially quite kind of complicated technical standards to my own fleet, the greatest impact you can make is not in your own fleet, it's in your supply chains. So by saying, if you want to contract with us, you have to have vehicles which are, you have to be signed up to FORS and clocks, which are national schemes, or your HGVs have to be DBS compliant. Because particularly local authorities are kind of great economic stimulators and big procurers, and they have kind of a big impact on the kind of wider piece. And then the more people that we can get involved in kind of specifying these standards in contracts, then the kind of greater the pressure on the market will be, and the more likely we are to see like that filter up to the regulatory level as well. And that kind of has an impact on cost. So it doesn't have to mean spending loads of cash to get this stuff done, because we've developed DVS, we've developed FORS, that's already happening. Clocks is out there. Most of these standards are all out there and going, and kind of innovation is happening to kind of keep those fresh and kind of keep them at the forefront of the development of vehicle technology. So I'm very happy to, and I'll share some links afterwards in the workshops. But I'm very happy to share anything on that. And there is kind of like a kind of critical mass and a momentum that we can kind of spread throughout all of this.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Amy, and thanks, of course, for your offer of sharing. Because I mean, you can't go unnoticed. London is unique. I mean, there's a unique funding model and takes the largest proportion of investment of in transport anyway of anywhere in the country. But I was quite sort of taken with your point that you made, that you don't need vast sums of money. It's just different ways of perhaps valuing things and tackling things. I mean, what advice could you give to local authorities a little bit more on that, in terms of how they can sort of do things in a cost-effective way without massive resource requirement? And of course, I was also impressed with your comments about procurement, which could easily be forgotten. Local authorities must be one, if not the biggest, procurer in the country. It commands billions, and if it could make a little change in that, that would have a dramatic effect right across the country. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about how you value things, so rather than put costs to them.
Yes, I think that's where the SAFE system is so valuable, is that you can scale it depending to what your kind of capability and your resource capacity is. And so there are some things that within the kind of pillars framework. So obviously Safe Streets is largely, you will have to do kind of some work about kind of redeveloping junctions and pieces like that. But there's also ways that you can kind of do signs and lines work that can kind of be kind of cheaper, but versus the kind of big major pieces about kind of redeveloping junctions. But there's kind of still ways you can scale within that. But then, yeah, looking at safer vehicles, a lot of the safer vehicle standards and the things that you can do don't necessarily cost money, because, as I was saying earlier, like it is the supply chain and the procurement where you can make the biggest difference. So I think there kind of are some kind of good, smart things that are kind of can be relatively cost effective there. Yeah,
thank you for that, Amy. I mean, Neale, you've just listened to what our panel guests have just said, and taking into account those views, I mean, what role would you see, particularly for a soft policy measures and approach aimed at attempting to bring about behavioural change as part of safe systems? And it does then beg the question for me: do local authorities and the safety partnerships have the right skills and capacity to deliver on behavioural change?
Thanks, Tony. Okay, two parts to your question. I'll take the first part in terms of soft policy measures. I think what we've got is actually a really exciting sort of transformation potentially happening here. And if we go back to the basics of the safe system approach and look at Vision Zero, sort of, that was predicated on it can never be ethically acceptable that people are killed or seriously injured when moving within the road transport system, right? Now, if we accept that, then there are sort of principles to abide by, and that's that safety is the primary priority. As Jess said, that there's energy management to human tolerances. And then thirdly, that we accept people will always make mistakes. Even when educated and well trained, they will make mistakes because they are human and they are fallible. And what that does is mean that we have to shift our attention from a mindset of fix the user to one of fix the system. And that's a huge change from the way that we've operated in the past. And in terms of how that impacts on soft policy measures, and by that I'm going to say largely education as a soft policy measure. We've traditionally used education in a role to try and improve safety in a way that doesn't involve hard policy changes, is fairly cheap to design and implement, and can reach a large audience quite easily. But what we found is that education isn't really a very good way or it's an ineffective way of changing behaviour, because changing behaviour is really quite difficult. And we've made some great progress in using the health domain to understand how to really design public health campaigns and to make the most of what we can do. But actually, what we really need to be using education for is to support the harder policy measures. That's when education becomes effective. And if we can use education in that way to support the safe system, we can help users to address the knowledge gap of what is the safe system. And actually, it's not just users at this point in time, it's probably all of us. We need to come to a consensus and an understanding of what it is and what we need to do within the industry as well. But then also to bring users with us to support a change in safety culture that starts to enable future changes. And some of those future changes will be big. If we genuinely want to reach an approaching Vision Zero sort of mindset or target in the future, some of those changes will be big and will go against current public opinion, such as when you start to propose reducing speed limits. To come on to your second part about local authorities and safety partnerships, I'm going to say I'm not sure if I'm the best person to speak of that, but in truth, listening to Tanya and what she highlighted earlier, it sounds like the landscape is very mixed at this point in time. And from what I've witnessed over the last 10 to 15 years and work with local authorities, there's been times of significant disinvestment and a lack of budget at a local authority level. But it feels to me that there's been a really big change over the last few years, and with a lack of leadership at a national level on a road safety strategy, I feel like some local authorities have done, quite frankly, astonishing work to really regroup, to develop skills, to develop strategies, and are actually showing leadership, such as what Amy was talking about at TfL and Matt's area as well. There's some really brilliant work out there. And we know that change is afoot at a national level, and here's hoping that starts to bring things together so that we can see a more consistent approach.
Yeah, some really interesting points you've raised there. But when you talk about leadership, whether it's at national or local level, it inevitably turns quickly to politics and the politicians. Ultimately, they are the leaders. And having worked in politics for quite a lot myself, I know how difficult it is to try and convince someone about spending money on a soft measure or a soft measure approach compared to a hard measure which saves a life instantly and they can see it. I mean, how would you square those two things for the politicians who are worried about how best they can make their investment when obviously soft side has got to be a complementary approach to the hard measures?
Well, I think this comes back to, I guess, the role of the user within the safe system. And let's be honest, it's not that well defined in truth. And it's something that, for me, is one of the areas of biggest development that needs to come. But as Jeremy pointed out in his presentation, the two roles for the user at this point are to comply with the traffic rules and to demand more from the people who design and run the system. And that second part, the demanding more, I think is really interesting, because at this point in time, we don't do that. Or there may be some occasions it happens, but by and large, the user is a disengaged party, is a receiver of a service. And in truth, that needs to turn around so that the user starts demanding more. And when the public demand more, politicians tend to learn or tend to respond. So actually, that might be the way that the politics gets more involved in supporting the harder measures, because the public actually want it. They want to be able to operate on safer roads. They don't want to feel at risk and that sort of thing. Yeah,
a fair point. We're coming close to the end of our session. I thought I'd just like to ask each of you the same question, and very, very brief answers indeed. The classic question: if you had 30 seconds in the lift with the Secretary of State for Transport, what would your ask be? And you've got about 20 seconds each. And I'll start with you, Jess. What do you think?
Start implementing. We've got all the right measures now to actually help us get to zero. You don't need to wait for autonomous vehicles. You don't need to wait for connectivity. Everything that we need to get us to zero is available now. Just get implementing.
Well put, Jess. And Matt, your ask?
But based on the fact Jess has already had her 30-second pitch, mine would be about making sure investment is targeted towards driving this behaviour at a local level and joining it up nationally.
Yeah, well said. And Amy?
Well, building on the other 2 points, I'd also say that like you can't have the active travel agenda without having safer roads to enable active travel. And so this should be a kind of key area where we kind of see that road safety strategy that really adopts the safe system and kind of sticks the money behind it.
Yeah, excellent. And Neale, fine, if there's anything left.
Not a lot, but I think I would ask them if they think it is ethically acceptable that people are killed and seriously injured on the roads that they are responsible for when there are no measures to reduce the number that are killed and seriously injured.
Yeah, absolute brilliant point. And with that, we come to the end of our session, unfortunately, because I know I've got about another hour's worth of questions in my head, and I would love to have spent time talking to you more. However, thank you very, very much for your participation. We're now about to move on to the workshop sessions, but before we do that, I'd like, of course, to thank our sponsors again, National Highways, Vision Zero Southwest, and Genoptic, because without that, their help today would not have happened. So I wish you all well, enjoy the workshop sessions, and don't forget, you don't have to come back. Goodbye.